Good morning. This is Nate Perrin, pastor of Out Friends Church, doing a casual devotional with you today. If you're following along in the Barclay Press Illuminate series, we'll be starting on page 94. The passage is Leviticus 9, 1 through 6, 22 through 24. I'll be reading verses 22 through 24. On the next page, numbers 11, 16 through 30. I'll be reading from verses 21 through 30. Leviticus. Aaron lifted his hands toward the people and blessed them. And he came down after sacrificing the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the offering of well-being. Moses and Aaron entered the tent of meeting, and then came out and blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. Moses said, "The people I am with number 600,000 on foot. And you say, I will give them meat, that they may eat for a whole month. Are there enough flocks and herds to slaughter for them? Are there enough fish in the sea to catch for them?" The Lord said to Moses, "Is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not." So Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord. And he gathered 70 elders of the people and placed them all around the tent. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to him, and took some of the Spirit that was on him, and put it on the 70 elders. And then when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, but they did not do so again. 2 men remained in the camp, one named Eldad and the other named Medad, and the Spirit rested on them. They were among those registered, but they had not gone out to the tent, and so they prophesied in the camp. And a young man ran and told Moses, "Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp." And Joshua the son of Nun, the assistant of Moses, one of his chosen men, said to him, "My lord Moses, stop them." But Moses said to him, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit on him." And Moses and the elders of Israel returned to the camp. Hey, let's talk about biblical leadership. During this time, it was a distressing time for the Hebrews. They had obviously grown. They had obviously grown closer to Moses and his leadership style during this time. But as we see in his passages, that God gives different leadership roles to the people for them to fulfill. So what does leadership look like? What does God do to equip the right leaders? I'll give you the number one leadership model I can think of. Sunday school answer, Jesus. A lot of leadership theory and the States, it gets pretty manipulative. It does. Like, I can tell whether or not a pastor's been reading those kinds of books by the way by the way they can treat people, by the way they try to control situations, by the way they try to make themselves the center of attention instead of making God the center of attention. When we look at Jesus, we don't see that. We see someone on his knees washing the feet of his disciples. We see someone allowing himself to be loved. We see someone who walks with the poor and destitute and doesn't care about his reputation. If Jesus were a narcissist, he would never have sat down with tax collectors and prostitutes and shared a meal with them. But in American leadership theory, it's all about getting ahead. It's all about crushing your enemies. It's all about trying to have the best appearance. But that's not the way of Jesus. Uh, the way of Jesus is someone who submits to God on a regular basis, follows the Holy Spirit's leading. Um, I am okay. As a pastor, I don't let myself be political. Especially with my work with Christian peacemaker teams, I just tell y'all what's going on and what you can do to help, but I'm not going to push any kind of political agenda on you. Um, to be frank, I'm Jewish. I know what happens when you bring politics into the pulpit. Because when that started happening, that's when, frankly, the Holocaust started. Uh, I have a firm conviction against that. Um, so when I talk about these stories, I don't want you thinking these are endorsements. All right. These are just stories I find interesting. So whenever someone asks me if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, I always say I'm a Christian because my role as a pastor is not political. And you can disagree with that, that's fine, but you're not going to change my perspective on that. Because, yeah. Anyway, I think of people like JFK when I think of an interesting leadership example. Not because of his politics or what he did as president, but because of his personality and character. Um, because even as a war veteran, people were constantly uh, underestimating JFK's ability. It wasn't until his own boat was split in two by Japanese, I think the word is destroyer, and he carried his entire crew on his own back to an island and rescued them. And because of that, he had a lifelong back injury. But when the Cuban Missile Crisis came around, Castro and the Soviets thought that this guy was really naive. They thought that he had no life experience, that he was too young to be a president. And shockingly enough, they ended up eating their own words when they realized this guy had some really serious leadership skill. And not only did he have the skill, but he also had heart because he recognized the gravity of what would have happened with nuclear warfare. I think it's just one of the most interesting stories about leadership you can find. Um, because of JFK, he was someone that was constantly underestimated. Um, and unfortunately, he was probably killed for it. Um, no, he was killed, but, I'm not going to talk about that thing. Then I think of Nelson Mandela, someone who was locked in a prison for decades, and he comes out with a heart ready to forgive, with a heart to set things right, with a heart to reconcile. Um, and he changes South Africa forever when he runs for president. Um, I think of people like that when I think of interesting leadership, of the type of leaders I want to be. Um, and by the way, there are probably several things about JFK's politics I would disagree with, but I don't know JFK's politics. I just know Cuban Missile Crisis and his personal life story. Obviously, his personal life is a mess, but it's a good to examine. Um, but when we think about leadership, we often have a certain figure in our minds. We think about, probably, classics. You think about probably even a pastor you've had. But once again, when I think about leadership, I try to focus myself on Jesus and what he would have me do. Um, I've learned to never ask the question, what would Jesus do? And instead ask the question, what is Jesus doing right now? And how would he have me respond? And the response is always to forgive, um, always to have, healthy boundaries, always to always make that extra effort to love my neighbor. And that's an uncomfortable place to be because it's very antithetical to the way we tend to think. We think a leader is someone who comes in, with boxer fists and sets people right. Uh, but usually that's not the case. And even with those kinds of leaders, we end up finding much later on uh, some of the craziness they had. I've read several missionary accounts where uh, people were gathered to the particular people for this gift, but then those people ended up abusing that gift. Um, because they take their focus off of Jesus. They take their focus on what it means to be humble. They take their focus on what it means to love. um, when it comes to leadership, we don't think we shouldn't think of natural characteristics. We should think of what the Holy Spirit does in that person. Back when I first started preaching, I got so nervous I couldn't sleep for 2 days, both before and after. Um, and I often ask God, uh, why He was calling me to this, because I wanted to live kind of a hobbit lifestyle. I wanted to sit with my books. I wanted to listen to music all day. But God was calling me out to something better, and I'm grateful that He called me out to it because I've started to enjoy preaching. I've started to enjoy all of that. And in the Quaker tradition, we have this theology um, that says that all people are ministers, and I do agree with that all Christians are ministers. That we all have our own thing that we're being called to. In the early church, they didn't have the same kind of pastoral roles that we have today. That's why it's hard for me to imagine why Paul would have an issue with a woman pastor, by the way. Because they were meeting in house churches. It was never centered on one person. It was always centered on the group. It was always centered on the Holy Spirit and what He was doing in that moment. So when we have this realization that God is calling us each to an individual ministry and to not simply just be sheep following one person, we realize we have a responsibility to follow that calling wherever it goes. That calling may not be as glamorous, but as glamorous as we want it to be. But it's something where God is calling us to. And God equips us along the way to do what we need to do. And I always find, I was a teenager, 18 years old. I was filling out applications to go to film school when I got this calling to be a pastor at Quaker Ridge Camp. There have been some days I wonder what would have happened if I went to film school instead. But I never regret saying no to film school. Because Barclay did change my life. I talked to so many people who've gone to Bible colleges and seminaries. And Barclay is a really special place because they just take people in and they help walk alongside them. God led me there. It's really bizarre how God uses an obscure small Bible college in the middle of nowhere to transform people. But that's just the way He works. But God always equips us for what we need and when we need to do it. It's not through manipulation that we become good leaders. It's not through having good charisma. It's not through, barking orders at people. It's through humbly submitting yourselves to God and being willing to be led. I have a saying, don't treat people like cattle, treat them like sheep, because that's my role as a shepherd. And that may sound stupid if you're a farmer, but to me, when I have this image of controlling cattle, it's a lot rougher. But when I'm controlling sheep, it makes a lot more sense. I don't know. That was probably really stupid, but that's the way I think. But always remember that God's leading you down a particular ministry, and the best way to discern that is to pray to God and ask Him what He would have you do. I'm at 15 minutes, so I'm going to cut off here. I hope you all are doing well during this during this season, and I'm looking forward to talking to each of you someday again. Grace and peace. Wash your hands.